The scrapping of the 2020 academic calendar has now put a pause for thought into what the normal, or rather the new normal, will look like for Kenya's education sector. To discuss what future looks like for the education in Kenya, I am joined by Amos Kaburu, an education specialist and program manager at PAL Network. A very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you, Nina.
Right, so Amos, what are your initial thoughts on the decision to cancel the 2020 academic calendar and move the reopening of primary and secondary schools to 2021?
Thank you. We designed for the majority, not for the minority. And so this makes a lot of sense. I know quarters, particularly the private schools, which are hard hit by that decision. But in the long run, it's the most favorable decision that could ever be made, because there is very little we could do in terms of salvaging the year 2021. The year 2020, when there is a lot of anxiety, when there is a lot of fear, because even if you have children in school, but they are not mentally set because of what is happening and the way our schools are, waiting for each day at 3 p.m. to find out things. So even mentally, children are not ready for school in the year 2020. We could have them physically there, but they will not necessarily be there. Of course, we have what we consider that school. I've seen in the last 2 months where pregnancy and such who get feeding programs at school, which are going to be lost. But the overall good supersedes some of these challenges. So it makes a perfect sense, considering that this was a healthcare crisis. It was not an education crisis.
Was it a sound decision for Standard 8 and Form 4 students to be allowed to resume school in September amid the ongoing battle against COVID-19?
No. They are not going to report in September, because that is a part of what had been proposed earlier on, that perhaps we could have a phased approach where Standard 8 and Form 4 could go to school. But you also have to look at the balance statement that the ministry made after consultations with the stakeholders. And it makes perfect sense, because even if you are to allow a candidature class to go back to school, they could only be there, and yet even after they have finished exams, they can't transit, because the classes that they are supposed to join are still occupied. So there will basically be no spaces that they could be joining. Even if you are to allow Form 4s to finish, it will only mean that they will only create 700,000 spaces, whereas we have got around 1.3 million Class 8 that are supposed to join secondary school. So we are dealing, of course, with a challenge of ballooning demand for education, because every year we have an addition of close to 1 million children that we are injecting in our and itself also means that we are also increasing the number of children who are getting into schools per se. So because, for instance, you will ask that the candidate of this year for KCSE, which is supposed to be around 700,000, 4 years ago when they sat for KCPE, they were close to 950,000. So the system has already lost over 250,000. And that happens to be the case, that by the time you start class 1 and class 8, you lose close to 350,000 children. That's about 35% of the children never make it to finish. So we still have the challenge of availing sufficient spaces. Of course, we have discussed so many times the issue of 100% transition, which also still comes into sharp focus. But now we also have got the increasing demands for what is now being called blended teaching and learning, which perhaps will facilitate a greater infusion of technology in how teaching and learning happens, but which we don't really to have done so much in terms of covering sufficient ground for us to be ready to run such.
Hand in hand with that, the CS spoke of having 2 Form 1 classes next year. How will this work? Won't the numbers be unbearable to deal with?
No. So we won't actually have 2 Form 1 classes next year, and that's even now the conclusion in terms of cancelling the year 2020, so that it is now just the year 2021 where we reset the baton, because even whatever little the children have learned, children equally lose so fast. Their memory is a little bit short, so they cannot keep staff for long, especially when they are removed from these contexts of teaching and learning. So we will have a situation where everybody will go back to the class where they were this year. So of course, there are also operational issues, such as maybe those who had already paid the fees what happens to them and such. And of course, today also the cabinet secretary has also made another statement that there is need that the schools should have negotiations with the parents to be treated as prepayments. That is a payment made before a service is provided. So that some of these fees could also be pushed to next year. But of course, we know that it's not just going to be that blanket, because even if services have been pushed to next year, there are also still others which are running. For instance, when you have got operational expenses such as electricity and water, which are very, very critical, which will still be happening. We know, of course, for the case of private schools, there is a around the same. Like there are those who are providing online classes and such, which are also case by case arrangements that proprietors or directors are able to make with the individual parents.
All right. So would a phased reopening approach work in Kenya's education sector? For instance, maybe have the Form 1s gradually, or rather we start with, let's say, Form 4 gradually checking in, and then later on having the Form 3s checking in, instead of having all students check into school at the same time?
Operationally, that is not possible because we do not have what we call resource calibrated around specific grades. For instance, you do not have school buses that only carry class 8 or Form 4s alone. Second, you also don't have teachers who only teach Form 4 or teach Form 3 alone. You also don't have dormitories for Form 3 and Form 4s alone. So the setup of our school is that there's a whole mix of everyone into that school. So it doesn't even make economic sense. It just makes life very, very difficult if you have to allow that phased approach. Because if you are to allow certain grades to come in, when the others come, where do they start and where do they finish? Do you rethink of when everybody will be doing exams or not? Of course, we have templates of how such institutions could be run. Like if you go to the University of Nairobi, the University of Nairobi is of how you can run a very, very flexible model. You never have got a specific time set at the University of Nairobi when they'll be doing exams. Unlike like if you go to other universities where you get what you're calling an examination fever, because everybody's going to sit for exams at the same time. But you see, University of Nairobi survives because of the economies of scale, and it has got a very, very huge faculty that is able to do that. So it's a good model to study, but you really can't also implement it on large scale unless you really have got certain fundamentals right.
That said, Amos, how best can the government then roll out the 2021 school calendar? Should the students start afresh or from where they left off?
No. They will basically be starting off afresh. Because when you open in January, you will basically start the curriculum for that time. Because as I've said, the assumption right now is that every child will basically have forgotten what they were doing. And even if they're not forgotten, it does not make sense to start because we also don't have sufficient mechanisms for us to test, for instance, all these children and now be sure that how many of them have proceeded or not. We actually have what we call group-based learning, which is not individualized learning. So you cannot teach children based on their individual needs. You have to group.
What about, sorry to cut you short, what about equitable access to education, be it in the private or public schools? How should the government address this as well?
This is a very, very complex issue. It is not easy per se, because education in itself is a merit good. And therefore, as a merit good, you are supposed to provide it for everyone. Just like access to things such as a sewerage system or call street lights, for instance. They do not have what you call non-exclusivity, neither do they have what you call indivisibility, therefore making them to be called public goods. Now, when you have got a private interest encroaching on the public sector, as we have seen in education, it becomes very difficult to mediate those interests because the private interests are about profit making. Of course, they also come in with other forms of call innovation and new approaches to how things perhaps as education will be provided. But that's not actually what we've seen in Kenya. We've seen an education system that is not complementary. That is, the public and the private do not seem really to complement each other. And I want to give you an example of what we mean by a complementary system. If you look at our energy production sector in this country, it's very, very complementary, because we have got private farms that generate electricity. But after they have generated that electricity, for you, the consumption in your house, you never know whether the electricity you are consuming came from a private generator, or whether it came from a national generator, because for you, all that you want to see is power. So that is how a perfect complementary system works. So you cannot have a system that appears to be very parallel. So that you have got the private this side, and then you have got the public the other side. But it's really going to take a lot of time before we come to a point where we can realize some of these things, because the way education has been situated at the policy making level, we are not, the level of understanding, some of these models are pretty new. Of course, like some of the things some of us have been spending a lot of time, and it's, for instance, also part of my dissertation at my PhD, where we're looking at aspects such as what will be the increasing role of the private sector in public education. And so we begin to look at project financing mechanisms, for instance, issues such as operations and maintenance contracts, so that you allow the private sector to come with that level of innovation. They do not necessarily have to be parallel investors, because it is too expensive to set up a private school. And now when they are such as this one, and you are taking a huge terminal loan from the bank, and now the bank is reaching out to you because they don't care whether schools have closed or not. They basically financed you based on your books.
So just sorry to cut you short once again. So what exactly, or how long will it take this particular country to get to a point where the education system is equitable?
It requires it is something that is dependent on so many factors. It is dependent on so many factors, and one of the things would be at this point in time, one of the practical things that governments need to do is to admit that it cannot do without the private sector in education, because the private sector will be able to really deepen access. And for instance, even if you had a quota system that calls that private sector have to invest in certain areas which are completely underserved, such as the slums of this country, such as the highly marginalized areas which are completely arid and such, so that you don't have to have private investors rushing and killing over each other, setting up schools next to each other, whereas the other areas which need resources and they are not there. That's one of the things. So you have to think, first of all, of the policy and the legal environment in which we operate. And one of the things that some of us have proposed is that we need to throw away that thing that we call the Public-Private Partnership Act of 2012, because it does not serve the purpose. It is a very, very weird kind of law. So because you cannot deepen a private sector participation unless you also look at the parent law, and the parent law in itself is extremely faulty.
It seems that that's a discussion that if we were to delve into will take so much time. Finally, Amos, what does this pandemic mean for the implementation of the competency-based curriculum? That's the CBC. Should it be set aside for now, considering the curriculum is more of, it's a hands-on curriculum? So should it be set aside?
No. Thank you. In fact, that discussion is very timely. That we also, at this point in time, have to rethink of how we recalibrate and how we think of designing the curriculum. Because if we are going to design the curriculum based on the old fundamentals, then definitely we are setting ourselves for failure. There's no better time for CBC to be implemented than now. We know, of course, that one of the principles of CBC is parental participation and engagement. And now we have seen what parents have done in the last 3 months. And now they still have another 6 months to sit with their children. So you can imagine if we're able really to harness, we will be coming out of COVID when we have got a clear-cut strategy of how to bring in parental participation, community service learning. These are two critical principles that form or are the bedrock of the competence-based curriculum. So of course, we say that competence-based curriculum is the triple H education. Education for the head, which is about knowledge. Education for the heart, which is about attitudes and values. And lastly is education for the hand, which now you are emphasizing. That is the skill that you acquire. And after that, now you are supposed to have the do part of it. So these are 4 components of the curriculum that cannot just be wished away. And now the only issue would be that now we have to rethink that if we thought implemented in the normal classroom as it was, then definitely we've been challenged to now know that it cannot be done as it was. This must adjust our fundamentals, how we have thought, how we have planned, how we have designed, and how we have packaged and delivered education to the masses, especially for the purpose of sustainable development.
All right, Amos. Well, thank you very, very much. That was Amos Kaburu, who's an education specialist and also the program manager at PAL Network, giving us an insight on the decision that was made yesterday by the government and Cabinet Secretary Magoha, Education Cabinet Secretary Magoha, that schools shall be closed and will be reopening in the year 2021.